Hi, my name is Jor, and today I'm speaking with Baroness Susan Greenfield about screen culture and Stare Into the Lights, My Pretties, my first feature-length documentary from 2017 about technology and the impact on society. Baroness Susan Greenfield is a pioneering neuroscientist, research scientist, author and broadcaster, focusing on the study of consciousness and the physical basis of the mind. She's working on treatments for Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, and is founder and CEO of NeuroBio, a biotech company developing treatments for neurodegenerative disorders. Her research in neuroscience and passion for science has seen her author 10 books spanning different aspects of the brain and the mind, as well as the personal and social impacts of screen culture and digital technologies. So, Susan, I just wanted to thank you very much for your time today. Very much appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Joel. Thank you. You forgot to mention my links with Australia, and especially with Melbourne.
Sure.
Yeah. So, I've been many times to Australia, at least once a year, until, of course, everyone was prevented from travelling. And initially to Adelaide as thinker in residence, but subsequently working a lot in Melbourne.
Definitely. I've seen you speak before. I've seen you speak twice before, actually. Once at the, perhaps it was the Uni of Melbourne. I don't remember now.
Yeah, I had for 3 years a visiting professorship at the University of Melbourne. Yeah. So I'm very jealous of you going into the springtime now, and also of you emerging from your lockdown, which we are entering right now.
I feel for you, yes.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
Mm-hmm.
So I should also say before we begin that you're one of my heroes, especially in the technology space, is that I appreciate your passion for science, but also that you're still grounded in the real world. And what I mean by that is that you're not stuck in a world of data and abstractions or cold rationalism or absurd conclusions. There's a life to your work, I think, which I think is really important as a scientist.
Well, that's very kind. I think it's sad if scientists are perceived not to be like that. And I think what I bring to the party, and it's different from most scientists, is I didn't start off as a scientist. So I came very late to science. And I think because I did classics, Latin and Greek and ancient history, and in maths, and philosophy before, I took on the hard science, for want of a better word. It gave me an appetite for asking the big questions and seeing the relevance of what I was doing, more than perhaps it might be for people who had a more conventional education in science.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk more about that? Just give us a brief primer on how you came to neuroscience, and then to bring us to topic, how screen culture began to concern you and when that happened.
How it came? Okay. I came to science because, as you said very nicely in your introduction, I was really interested in the mind, and that in turn had been fascinating me ever since I did ancient Greek at school and studied the Greek philosophers, and then I wanted to do philosophy at university. And so I've always thought that philosophers ask the really big and exciting questions, and I really enjoyed just sort of savouring. As someone once said, it's better to ask some of the questions than know all of the answers, and I used to really enjoy just not knowing something and kicking it around and admitting we didn't know, which I think philosophers, I don't know if any philosophers watching, but for my mind, that's what they did, yeah. But then when I was at university, it was all a bit too abstracted, and you had to do it also with psychology. And when I did that, psychology actually did give a grounding in the real world. And having done this very, very demanding but completely abstracted Latin, Greek grammar and so on, actually having things that made sense and I could reason and I could test, that actually had a real appeal. So I renounced philosophy and went first to psychology and then migrated to neuroscience, where I got more interested in the physical brain, and actually found that the kind of questions that are posed in philosophy or when I was doing classics actually could be addressed from a very different standpoint, but one that you could actually test with neuroscience. So that's how I ended up as a neuroscientist. But I've always, I think, if I had a central theme, it's always been, I've been fascinated by the individual, what makes an individual, what makes you different from me, what makes you unique for the 100,000 years we've walked this planet. You'll never have anyone like you, never again, even if you've got a clone, an identical twin. And that's always interested me hugely, along with issues of consciousness and how one sees oneself and how one lives in a world that no one else can hack into. But I think it's always this individuality that I've thought very special, especially significant for human beings, to greater or lesser extent for other animals. And that then leads on, if individuality and your own personal inner environment, your consciousness is so precious and so fascinating, how is it being impacted by external stimulation, which I would argue is unique in screen technologies? Because in the past, you've always had to mix with other people. And even though you might have had, the car or the fridge or the printing press, you've still lived in the real world. Whereas now you can get up, you can go working, you can go shopping, you can go dating, you can play games, all without meeting another human being. And as a neuroscientist, knowing how much the screen technology impacted on the brain and how it literally left its mark on the brain, that really it both intrigued and horrified me in equal measure back in about 2009, when really it became apparent to me that this was a different type of environment from any other that we'd had before. And if that was the case, then rightly or wrongly, for good or bad, we might be having a different kind of mentality, a different kind of person, a different kind of consciousness than ever before. And so then what happened was, because I have the privilege of being in the House of Lords, where you can speak in debates, and there was a debate on child pornography, and the etiquette is you talk on an area of the debate that you're an expert on. And obviously I wasn't a legal expert to talk about pornography regulation, but all I said, any neuroscientist I think would have said this in my little speech, was, we know that the environment leaves its mark on the brain, the environment's changing, so therefore the brain might be changing. And that triggered a huge avalanche, much of it negative. Baroness says computers rot the brain, they said, and it was international. And it was quite astonishing. Any neuroscientist, I think, would have said what I said, but I'd obviously touched a nerve. And that triggered a lot of debates. It made me think and read and talk about it more, even though, as you said, my day job is Alzheimer's. I was still felt empowered enough and interested enough to research further. And that resulted in a book in 2014 called Mind Change, which I said the parallels were like climate change, and that they were controversial and unprecedented, but above all multifaceted, in that they raised lots of areas of your life. It couldn't just be one thing. So, for example, the issues raised by social networking are different and distinct from those raised by video games, are different again by those raised by search engines, because they're so pervasive. Since then, it seems that people have accepted much more that screen technology is not a wholeheartedly good thing, and that we have to think about the implications, and there are many implications. So in one way, I feel kind of vindicated from speaking out earlier, but on the other hand, it's sad that it's one of the areas where it's sad that to be proven right, actually. That a lot of now what people are saying seems to chime with what I was worried about so long ago. So.
Mm-hmm. We live in a techno-dazzled world, and there's considerable resistance to the very idea of challenging technology.
Is that Google Maps? Is that Google Maps? Is that Google Maps?
They are trying to turn everybody into what looks a lot like an addict.
Not only addictive, but obsessive compulsive addictive.
It's unprecedented that although the old argument is, technology has always been here since the printing press and the car and the telephone and the television, never before have these technologies changed our environment from 3 dimensions to 2 and challenged the boundaries as not just information technology, but nanotechnology and biotechnology are doing. They are radically shaking up our concepts of space and time in a way that the motor car or the television or the printing press did not. So therefore I don't take that old argument of saying it's the same as it's not.
Okay. So with that, do you want to just respond to that? Because we still hear this catch cry today. And we can talk about the backlash that you just mentioned too. We still hear this. Technologists argue that, progress is inevitable and that the escalation of technology is an end in of itself. So how is this time unprecedented and not like others?
Okay, I could address those criticisms first, actually, which I think and that what people tend to conveniently forget is many of the technologists saying that are making a profit out of this. And I think that one shouldn't overlook the slightly inconvenient truth that these are, that these are ways of making money out of people. Just so I just put that as one issue. So they might not be wholeheartedly as objective as one would have liked them to be. Yeah. So how are they changing us? Well, there's so many ways in which we can look at this. Yeah. I think you only have to. I don't know where to start.
Yes, I know.
Let's take the three broad areas I outlined. So let's take gaming, search engines, and social media. Yeah, let's take those three separate things because they, if you do any of those things, I think they change different aspects.
Well, gaming is massive. I mean, you can even focus on gaming. I think it's the stat I was reading in production of the film is that gaming is bigger than film, television, radio, and all other forms of media combined.
Yeah. Okay, so that begs the question, why? There must be something it's offering that films and books are not offering, yeah? And my own view is that it's offering an immersion in a world that's dominated by action. I mean, you wouldn't really have a video game of Jane Austen, would you? Or of Kafka, it has to be, it has to be a kind of, or Proust.
The game of Kafka is more like reality.
A game of that. So, it's true. Unless someone's listening, perhaps they're going to rush out now and do Pride and Prejudice as a video game. But I think that speaks to the fact that when it comes down to extreme actions, that comes down to sex or violence, or both, really. I mean, you're not going to have someone just thinking as a video game, are you? And what saddens me there with video gaming is, whereas a book gives you an insight into what someone is thinking, you see the world through a different perspective, which is both enlightening and interesting, compared to one's own. Video game is just action. And that's the big difference between a video game and a book. It's action. It's not insight. Yeah. And moreover, it's often violent action. And because you've only got two senses, which is hearing and vision, you have to overdo it in order to keep the person attended. So it's very fast, it's very bright, it's super noisy. It's not like the normal world. And moreover, you're safe, so you can kill people off. You can, you're just sitting there in your mind. So unlike in the real world, because if you hit someone, they're going to hit you back, and it's going to hurt. And we know that excitement does cause release of dopamine, which underlies addiction. And I think talk to any parent who's got an adolescent kid with Fortnite, and they will tell you that addiction is very real to computer games. That's not to say every person doing a video game is going to get addicted, but there is nonetheless an element of compulsion and addiction. No one would deny that nowadays, I think, to the video games. And I think my sadness there, I know it improves things like sensory motor coordination probably or something, but it means every hour you're doing that, it's an hour not reading Jane Austen. It's not, it's an hour not being outside and making sure you don't get obese, and running around. So you only have so many hours in the day. And whilst, yes, it might be part of the repertoire of the 21st century that one has video games, I think if they are addictive and they are stopping you doing healthy or mind-expanding things, then we have to look at them very carefully.
I've often spoken about the benefits of screen culture being one of agile processing, but how that mustn't be confused with content. Now, there's a book written a while ago now by someone called Stephen Johnson called Everything Bad is Good for You, which extolled the benefits of screen culture. And one of them is that it could be linked to high IQ, because the skills that you rehearse when you play video games are similar to those that are required to do well in IQ tests. That's to say, you don't need a lot of facts or infrastructure or hinterland, but you do have to be very agile at looking at patterns and connections and getting to an answer in a rather fast time frame. So the idea is that because the human brain is always good at what it rehearses, if you're rehearsing that, you're going to be good at it. And so then you go to an IQ test and guess what? You'll be good. But even Stephen Johnson says, just because, as many claim, we're seeing an increase in IQ scores in certain societies, we're not seeing an increase in empathy or understanding. We're not seeing insights into the economic woes of the world or the Middle East crisis. No one's suddenly come up with their superior cognitive abilities with insights that we would regard as important. And I think what you need to do, therefore, is on the one hand, yes, it's very good for mental processing, for what used to be called fluid intelligence. That's to say, where the emphasis is on giving a right response to an input. But that's not the same as understanding. Information is not knowledge. And I think this is what people confuse. And by knowledge, I refer to content. And content, for me, is true intelligence, which is where you can see one thing in terms of another. So, for example, the bit in Macbeth, out, brief candle. In order to really understand that, you have to see the analogy between the extinction of the candle and the extinction of life. You can't just say, take a candle literally. And I think that that's what we are missing out on. That's what might be in jeopardy. That's certainly not enhanced by doing very fast, clever things with video games, even though you might be able to give impressive responses very quickly, correct responses very quickly. That's not the same as understanding, and I think we have to be careful about differentiating them.
Yeah, so then we have search engines, and the issue there is it's facts for facts' sake, and facts on their own are really boring. Facts are only worthwhile, I submit, when they are joined out to make ideas, which is why something like Trivial Pursuits or pub quizzes are not up there with the Nobel Prize, because just knowing a fact, and if you go to a party, and you meet somebody who just tells you facts all evening, that's pretty dull. Yeah, it's when facts are joined up that they're interesting, and you see one thing in terms of something else. Now, that is not automatically guaranteed from search engines. Search engines will tell you something, and certainly in my work all the time, I'm using Medline all the time, and I'm using search engines all the time, because you want facts, you want immediate things, you want to check something, and it's there, and it's fantastic. But that's very different from suddenly seeing the world in a way that no one else has seen it, and that comes through having a brilliant teacher and a good education and someone that guides you and helps you. And that's why, someone once said everyone remembers a good teacher. But as I've said, no one ever says everyone remembers a good iPad. And then, of course, there's social media. And, are 500 friends really the same as real friends? Do you really want to download everything and share everything with everyone? Because we love talking about ourselves. And most normally what happens is body language when you're talking to someone face-to-face in the real world is like a kind of handbrake. So it stops you unloading or unburdening yourself to someone who might then bully you or mock you or make you feel low in self-esteem. If those things are not there, if that handbrake's not there, off you'll go, rattling away about yourself. And then what happens is, you'll be made to feel inadequate or in some way. So what you might do then is conflate. You might invent a fake you, who's got lots of boyfriends and girlfriends and is really popular and so on. And then what happens to the real you? The real you is lonely.
Yeah. Or just portraying that side of yourself that's the ideal self.
Exactly. And I think it's encouraging people to see themselves as brands.
Yeah.
Rather than as real human beings with feelings and friends and in the real world. And I find that very, very sad. And we know that there's an increase in psychiatric issues as a result, of that. So I think, obviously we could amplify all those points a lot, but that's just a kind of overview of some of the issues that I think a screen life, let's call it a screen life. It's a cyber life, it's so whereas the other technologies complemented and enriched the real world, having a car changed your life in the real world, being able to buy, but now having a screen life is a parallel universe, almost literally. You can just sit in your room all day doing that.
We could talk about, one other direction I wanted to go was, I think the first time I heard you speak on these issues was in 2009. And I think we did the interview for the film in 2013. So one of the questions I did want to put to you was, what's happened since then? What's stayed the same? What's gotten worse? What's gotten better, if anything?
I think it's become much more mainstream. And I'm no longer some weirdo, person about to join the Amish who's, reviled as being some technophobe. I don't think. Yeah. But in the House of Lords, for example, about 2 years ago, we had a big debate. And I should just say about the British House of Lords that unlike the House of Commons and unlike many parliaments around the world, in the Lords, you only really will speak about something that you feel you know a bit about, compared to everyone else. And we do have debates sometimes, perhaps not at the moment because of COVID, that really are very interesting. For example, we had one on stem cells a few years ago, and anyone who didn't know anything about stem cells could have heard different aspects, the economic, the medical, and the societal and all the rest of it, ethical. And we had one on Screen Technologies, and it was Baroness Kendrick, if anyone wants to look it up. And it was January, I think, about 2018. And we have British Hansard, you can look it up. And there again, there was ethicists and there was medics and psychiatrists and psychologists and people like me and everyone giving a shortish speech of about 5 minutes to that. And I think I felt very heartened by that because I felt everyone now was accepting it from a much wider range of sectors than when I first started. So I think that's changed. I think now people are, it's very interesting, the COVID crisis, because I think that's given us an experiment in accelerated screen life where many people who perhaps had their foot in the real world now have been forced, no fault of anyone. Yeah. And it may be that we're seeing, and I don't have specific evidence on this, but I've heard anecdotally that people are starting to realize how sad it is if you can't touch someone or give them a hug. Yeah. And if you can't go out into the real world and experience all 5 senses being stimulated. And, if you are removed from other people, why is it that Zoom calls aren't as satisfactory as sitting, with a friend in a... And I think it is a way of actually coming home to people. In one sense, that's perhaps one of the very small positives that we're getting from this horror show that we're all in at the moment, that it's making us appreciate the real world and interacting with real people, in real time. I think also something that I touched on in that clip that you played that has increasingly fascinated me at a very basic level. So I think when I first started, it was things like, are computers good for this or bad for that? And, is this particular task affected or not affected? And is this skill worse? Or, But now it's really made me think about time and space, actually, that the space is very small. It's a little screen. And time no longer really exists because you can talk to people at any time, anywhere, and you can access things. And I think in one sense, that's not necessarily 100% great, if you think about it, well, for 2 reasons. Mm-hmm. Let's take the space thing first. Someone has shown, and I reference it in my book, A Day in the Life of the Brain. I think it's Vincent. I can't remember the name. I think it's him. But he showed that when you're in big spaces, time slows down. So that's why perhaps people will go and sit by lakes or go to mountains, because, and the way he showed this was to have people interacting with models. And if the models were very large, their sense of time passing was much slower than if that very same model was miniaturized or smaller. Yeah. And so one might think that if you're in a world where you're not by lakes or mountains, you are much more in front of a little screen, even worse, a little cell phone screen, that time might pass very quickly as opposed to that very slow meditative time standing still that you get in places that people choose to go and like cathedrals or anything that's very large. So I think that's and then the other is time. The screen encourages simultaneity, and also people say about multitasking as that's a fantastic thing. Yeah. But actually human beings are bred for linearity and for sequencing. Yeah. So you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every sentence has a very clear beginning, middle, and an end. And if you explore, I may have said this before, I've said it many times, about what is thinking and how does thinking differ from feeling. A feeling is just there. It's an emotion. You have it. You cry, you laugh, you scream. Yeah, that's it. It's out of any context. You're just having that emotion. Yeah. Whereas a thought differs, and it can be any kind of thought, but it has, A equals B, B equals C, A equals C. With any kind of thought, and it can be a lie, a fantasy, whatever you want, you end up in a different place from where you started. And how did you get to that different place? By a sequence of steps. And the man who developed the treatment for Parkinson's, a man called Hornakowitz, he said this brilliant definition of thinking. He said, thinking is movement confined to the brain. Yeah. So if you bear in mind then that sequencing, whether it's a sentence or a walk or a movement confined to the brain, the emphasis is on staying on track. And we talk about thinking straight, don't we? We always want to write something down to clear our mind. Yeah. So I think linearity, where one thing comes after another, is very important for human beings, especially for adults. And it's what a thought is. Yeah. It's the essence of a thought, and it underlies, therefore, a story. So we love stories. Yeah, we like our own life story, and a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, if you're on the screen, that doesn't have a story. That doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can backtrack. You can do it simultaneously. You can have it all jumbled up. And I just wonder if that's altogether a good thing for one's, mentality as a human being, with the mandate that we have for stories and life stories and for thought being characterized by that sequence of processing. Yeah. So put those two things together, an environment that is miniaturized, where therefore the sense of time passing is in a rush and sped up, combined with where you're encouraged to engage in activities that don't actually encourage thought, slow thought. Yeah. I think we're shortchanging people. I think that younger people, especially if they're not given the chance to sit and think, to actually stare at the wall. And that's the advantage of reading a book, because in sensory terms, it's so low grade. It's just printed words on a page. In itself, it's not a sensory stimulation. But it takes you, look where it takes you, into this special place that no one else can come into. It's just why we always say the book is better than the film. And I certainly say infinitely better than the video game. Yeah. So what I'm concerned about on a very deep level, much deeper than when perhaps we last met, is just people's consciousness, how that's changing, not whether they're better or worse at certain skills that you test in a lab or can measure. Yeah. It's not so much that, it's more their whole quality of their consciousness. Mm-hmm. I'm concerned about, if that makes sense.
Oh, it totally makes sense. There's a bunch of different directions we can branch off from here. I mean, I've heard you speak before about we're looking at a generation of people that may not become like robots, that they may become more like 3-year-olds. Short attention spans, very volatile, not very empathetic.
Yeah. Well, there's someone standing for it. Oh, well, perhaps I would not say this political comment.
You may, you definitely may.
well, there is someone standing for election at the moment where it fits that profile. Is not a child, but
well, it's a cultural thing too. Yeah. If you want to make a comment, we could talk about this being on a cultural level. I think we do see the reinforcement of that scatterbrain type sort of thinking and emphasis. I mean, I've heard you speak before. You speak about this in the film of process over content, about how things are superficial and there's not much meaning in anything going on. We could talk about this in the society of the spectacle sense, Well,
I think, as I say, there is a danger of people becoming infantilized. I remember when I first read, people wearing onesies as though they were 1-year-olds. Onesies, these kind of suits that take away the sex from you. They're kind of asexual things that that hide it, and that almost is turning yourself into a child. And there's so much that I think speaks to people wanting to act and behave like children, when actually there's so much more they could be doing. And I had a colleague and she's late 20s, and she bought her and her boyfriend water pistols or something so they could play water pistols with each other. And I thought, well, fine, but it's a bit bit strange, well, when there's so much quality, there's limited time we have on this planet. Yeah. But I think the most thing about being a child is you're self-referential. I've got a hamster. My favorite color is red. Me. And obviously a kid will do that because it's got no other frame of reference. And it can't generalize to general statements because it's not had the experience of life for doing that. So, you can only refer to yourself and talk about yourself. But sadly, when adults do that and they're self-referential, I think that and solipsistic, that again is a diminishing. It's a diminution of what's happening.
Well, look at the history of blogging. I couldn't resist this. 1999, from eBlogger, I just have to tell someone about this thing my cat did today. Fine, something you might blog with. Flickr, oh my God, cat pictures, 2004. YouTube in 2005, moving cat pictures. And that pinnacle of civilization, Twitter, in 2007, 1 p.m., my cat just sneezed. 1:02, cat sneezed again. 1:04, cat hasn't sneezed recently, getting worried. Now, doesn't this remind you of a very, very small child? Look at me, mummy, I'm putting on one sock. Look at me, I'm doing this. Look at me, I'm doing that. And it's not so much that what you're doing is particularly different or special. It's what would happen if you weren't saying that. Would you actually be existing? And could this be people in existential crisis, I wonder, who feel they have to give this flood of consciousness and read out about themselves, banal though it may be, as a kind of continuity, an externally enforced continuity that would normally come by us having just a past and a future that's robust and continuous, that transcends the moment.
I think we live in a kind of paradoxical time. The world is more and more and more and more complex. On the other hand, we're only going to ask you a question that you can answer in 2 seconds. So we leave ourselves less and less time for reflection because our communications media push us to quick responses. And quite frankly, the questions before our planet right now are not questions that should be answered or thought about in the time space of texting.
So that was Sherry Turkle, author, of course.
Oh, yes, I know she is. Yes, I'm a great admirer of her. Yeah.
I'll just tell the audience about her book, Alone Together. It's a fantastic book about screen culture, subtitled How We Expect More from Technology and Less from Ourselves. So you can take that anywhere you want. I mean, are there themes in that clip that...
Yeah, I think what's really important that she brings out there is time, this element of time, and it seems to be a given now that things have to be done quickly. Yeah, and you have to, and there's a premium on speed. But if you go with my definition of thinking, that it's a sequence, it follows the longer the time frame allocated to something, the more time you have to think. Yeah, and if everything is done quickly and you have to respond, I think the other issue with the intrusion of the outside world is that you are on the back foot. You're responding rather than driving it. Yeah, so a really interesting thought. Is when you're a kid, I don't know, Jo, when you were a kid, but certainly in my day, you'd say to another kid this magic thing, let's make up a game. Let's make up a game. And here's this box, and this box can be a castle. No, it's not. It's a spaceship. No, a bloody box, just boring old box. And if you had anything, and that ability to invent a story from nothing, other than what's inside you, I think is very important, because in a sense what you're doing there when you make up a game, you're developing an identity that comes from inside you. It's your identity, Whereas when it's some second-hand invention coming in from the outside, that is not allowed you. You're just responding. You're on the back foot. You're responding to someone else's imagination, someone else's let's make up a game. Whereas when it comes from you, and that gives you a strength and a self-confidence, I think. When you're a kid and you make up games and play endless games, that gives you a little sort of sense of identity and a sense of self and an inner world that people can't necessarily share. And since we last met, something that we won't have spoken about that I think is symptomatic and I find very interesting is how tattoos are so mainstream. Yeah. Now, tattoos have been around forever. But in the 90s, there was this film, An Officer and a Gentleman. I cite this particularly with Richard Gere. And he had a tattoo and he was trying to be an officer. And the guy in charge said, officers don't have tattoos. And so even as recently as just over 20 so years ago, tattoos were not regarded as something necessarily that you would want as, to actually promote yourself. Yeah? Whereas now, everyone has them, and I just wonder why tattoos are so popular. And my answer to myself is that in a world where everything is impermanent, where everything is shifting, where nothing lasts, where everything can be easily displaced or replaced and has to be done very quickly, where you can download everything, where everyone encroaches on your thinking and your sharing, and everything is downloaded, even your most intimate thoughts, because you're a brand and you want the following, that perhaps a tattoo represents to people something that is permanent by definition, and it's that very permanence that is appealing. And moreover, the fact it's indelibly on your skin forever means it's yours and it can't be downloaded or shared with anyone else, And I'd say it's just an idea, but it is quite interesting, I think, how tattoos over the last 10 years or so have taken off when they've been around. The so-called technology of them has been forever. So it's nothing new. But I just wonder if that coincides with the increasing screen culture and how people see themselves and wanting to be private or special in a way that the screen technology has taken away from them.
I have another clip here. This one didn't make it into the film, but can hopefully continue to steer us in this direction of about themes of addiction and social control and so on. It's a sequence of toddlers throwing tantrums over not having an iPad.
Oh, yeah.
And we can, talk about this after the clip.
Blue, what do you want, babe?
I want an iPad.
I need to take the iPad to work.
Facebook people.
What's wrong?
I want an iPad.
What do you want, honey?
Can I see this?
I think that's one of the scariest things I've seen in that clip.
Definitely. Particularly the last one I find very chilling.
Sure. Well, I think there's two immediate reactions on that. One is the American Pediatric Academy says that no child under the age of 2 should have any screen exposure whatsoever. None. It's just bad. Their eyes are not developed, and so that is just horrible to see a small child, being given that. And parents do say, that when the children are told to stand away from the screens, they react in a way that they don't react if you just confiscate their other toys or their normal toys. Yeah. The other really sad thing was the dog in one of them. The dog went to console the child. Yeah. Which shows how the dog had more empathy than the kid did, Because I've heard this about dogs, by the way, that if they see someone crying, they'll go and lick you. And if you're laughing, they'll take their ball over to play with you. So to create empathy. And the fact the child hit the dog away, I find, was in a conventional previous life, a dog going up to a child, the child would love that, the child would play with the dog and would interact with it and, most kids would love to play with animals. So I find that, that was sad. That was so sad. I think that they do react in a way that they don't react when withdrawn from other things, and I do stress again that there's someone called Richard Saitowich who's written a lot on this. He's based in Washington. He's a neurologist, and he's written a lot about screen technologies and how, especially for very young children, it really is against all what the experts say they should have. People think mistakenly the kids are looking clever, and the fact that the kid, but quite the opposite is the case. It's the most damaging thing you could be doing, and it has to be done very carefully, and have to look very carefully at how often you let children have the screen technologies, because there is a fascination there, and that does beg the question why. And they should be out engaging with the real world and learning about the real world, not just having this hyper stimulation.
Well, we can, in terms of hyperstimulation, I have another example we could play too about, so I have a sequence here of gamers that are throwing similar tantrums. They lose the game and they completely break out into violent outbursts. I'll just pull this up for you.
Fuck you! Fuck you!
I put it in your face, fucker!
What the fuck? Go out there, what the fuck are you guys doing?
Fucking love to do. God, bro, just fucking play me! Fuck! Fucking it, man.
just wonder where you got the axe from. It's not the sort of thing you normally have in your bedroom.
I know, you have an axe waiting for your angry rage. Like,
it's not the sort of thing you normally have to hand, is it, in your bedroom?
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So obviously there's this issue about violence. And does that encourage violence and so forth in video games? And a lot of people use the rather specious argument. They say, well, since video games have been around, there hasn't been an increase in murders or something, or there's a statistic. And I think that's, it's not so much that it's encouraging you to go and kill someone, but it is encouraging, as we've seen, a very adversarial, aggressive demeanor. Yeah. And whilst those are extreme, nonetheless, you can think about people who, because they no longer are used to interacting socially with someone and looking at body language, will be more adversarial and childlike in the way they communicate, and slightly more hostile and defensive, yeah, in a very small way, even compared to those exaggerated ways. So the other thing is, what a way to spend your life on this planet, you know, when you've been given this human brain. And I just wonder what the ancient Greeks would have thought if they saw the pinnacle of civilization was that, you know, but what have we done with technology? What have we done with the things that technology can give us? Is just to have tantrums like a 3-year-old, yeah, rather than harnessing its undoubted powers to enrich your real life, you know. So, and the other worry is you think that, you know, when I'm on my Zimmer frame, these people are going to be running the world. You just wonder what kind of society. I also wonder, for this generation of this century, if you're brought up in this screen world that is so remote from other people and so devoid of human interaction, real human interaction, what kind of marriages are they going to have? What kind of parents are they going to make? What kind of work colleagues are they going to be in the workplace? Well, I suppose work, if it's all automated and remote, perhaps not so much, but you do wonder what kind of society we're going to have if people are going around having tantrums like 3-year-olds and so very self-centered and very emotional. And I think that's the whole point. It's because they're not being encouraged to think. I know that sounds very old-fashioned, but you're encouraged to think by having time and space, not by having something barging in on you. And also it means that you are going to be manipulated. And this is something we haven't touched on at all, Joel, which is how, you know, the masters of the universe who design these things and make money from these things, don't people realize that they are being manipulated and surveyed, of course? And, you know, if it's free, guess why it's free? It's because you're paying in some other way. Yeah. And again, ethically, that worries me. There's lack of privacy, again, the demise of the individual and the exploitation of the individual, especially given they think they're being glamorous and trendy and high tech with lots of friends, and actually they're being used. And I think that's something that people won't point out in the same way that in the 1950s, people who pointed out that cigarette smoking was benefiting the cigarette companies. Because if you're having fun and the people are making money out of you, you know, you're not going to be that popular if you try and stop the party.
The basic fundamental paradigm of advertising is called one-to-one marketing. That's what was made possible by the internet. I can know everything you do and I can reach you at any point. I can reach you and your friends, and I can target you, and I can engage in invisible digital behavior modification.
Yeah.
So we have 15 minutes left, and before we close, I wanted to, I mean, there's still so much more to discuss, but I wanted to definitely ask you about, well, I had you to talk about artificial intelligence, this trajectory we're on, everything sort of marching towards being totally enveloped in the virtual world. But I guess my specific question was for you to explain to us your views on artificial intelligence as a neuroscientist.
Sure.
And perhaps one place I wanted to start with this is how so many technologists and futurists do this sort of mechanistic projection onto the real world. They'll say things like the brain is a computer and humans are just machines made of meat and so on. So what's wrong with this?
Yeah. Okay, what's wrong with that is you'll find that most of those people, in fact, I don't know of any neuroscientist who said that. You know, they're all physicists or businessmen
computer
or visionaries on Mars, but very few of them have actually held physically a brain in their hand or actually studied the biological brain, yeah? And that's not to decry, say, their abilities. I think there's two ways of approaching this, and there's two scenarios, if you like, which we can separate out. One is where humans become like machines, cyborgs, yeah, or alternatively where machines become like humans, robots. So we can take each of those in the remaining time. So let's think about cyborgs first, yeah. People think that they can enhance their mental and physical skills in some way. For example, Elon Musk, I can't remember what the name of it is now that his program is, but it's where he's promoting on the website, I think Neuro something, you'll be able to talk to your computer, you know, with an implant in your head or something. And it does beg the question why you'd want to do that first. You know, what would be the advantage of doing that? And also ignoring the fact that if you're directing something out to the computer, it just as easily can beam something back in, if that was possible, into controlling you. So, you know, I don't think that's too handy a thing. Yeah. And moreover, physiologically, it's just not plausible. You know, you can have a desire to move, say, via an implant, which has been shown very impressively by scientists around the world for people who are paralyzed. You know, they can actually control things. And so that's fine. But that's just the will to move. That's control. That's the motor system, just getting a muscle to contract. Having an idea, you can't actually, how would you embody that, or how would that be represented? It's a memory, which is so contingent on other memories, and that evolves and changes with you as you evolve and change with your. So when you remember going to the seaside with your auntie when you're 5, it's different from when you remember that same thing when you're 20 or when you are 50. You know, it varies. So there's no such thing. A memory isn't a fact, yeah? And much of your thoughts are not simple facts. That's the whole point, which we've said. So I can't see how they could be downloaded. On a simpler level, the so-called transhumanism, where you're trying to augment your abilities. Again, why? Why would you want to have better ability? When you think about people you might most admire, like Einstein or Shakespeare or Mozart, they weren't distinguished by the speed with which they did things or the superiority of some ability they had over someone else. No, they're distinguished by being highly original, by being highly creative in their different fields. So that can't just be bought or downloaded or implanted, yeah? So it's kind of missing the point, transhumanism, about the kind of things, if you want to be an exceptional, unique, wonderful human being, just having a faster memory than someone else or being able to do something quicker than someone else can do it. You know, I don't see, it's not the same thing at all. And we ought to be thinking about how can we shape a society that brings us Einstein and Mozart and Shakespeare, not how we can. And again, another aspect with that as well, an ethical one, would be even if you could have some techno enhancement, what would that do to the world? You'd have a kind of division that's even worse and more horrendous than the social divides we see now, and so on. You know, so you have the techno enhanced whereas the techno underprivileged. You know, imagine, even if it was possible. So I think for many reasons, this cyborg scenario is not an attractive one, but also to my mind, it's a nonsensical one. I don't think it's going to take off. We then go the other way around, which is more plausible, and think now our robots going to become like humans. You know, we're going to have robots, machines going to become like humans. And that touches on something called the Turing test. So Alan Turing, in the middle of the last century, had this test where you'd know if a computer was conscious. If given impartial access, you couldn't tell whether you were talking to any question you asked. You wouldn't know whether it was being answered by a human or a computer. And there's been no computer that's passed the Turing test, but I have to quip. There's this lovely thing by Stuart Sutherland, a psychologist. He said he'd know a computer was conscious when it ran off with his wife. Which I think would be you see, that's really, because it does touch on the essence of emotion and consciousness. It's not, whilst of course computers can do calculations better than we can, of course they can, but there's far more to being human than doing calculations. It's running off with other people's wives, that makes us, having emotions and having a drive. And computers don't have ambition, they don't have ambition. So all this. That's my question. It's because we're talking about mimicry there. We're talking, simulacra. It's like there's this desire for, can machines be alive? Is that even possible? Is an electronic or mathematical or computer language mimicry of neurons firing in a brain sufficient to create a mimic of consciousness? Is it? No, it's not. This is where I think you'll find that all the enthusiasm and the fear and the issues that are kind of whipped up about AI come from non-neuroscientists, because for me as a neuroscientist, I know that there's qualitative aspects to how the brain functions, the different chemical messengers it uses, not just numbers. And moreover, the central nervous system is interfaced with the endocrine system and the immune system, otherwise you'd have biological anarchy, which in turn are interfaced with the whole body. So you have a very complex biological system interfaced by trilingual chemicals that interact, and these chemicals are different from each other. And no one replicates that in silicon. And silicon, it reduces it to algorithms, as the great, he's just won the Nobel Prize actually, Roger Penrose, who's at Oxford, he said, there's no algorithm for intuition or common sense, and yet they guide us all the time. So, of course, one can have extraordinarily clever, in inverted commas, machines, but they do not have the essence that so far has distinguished biological systems, which is to have consciousness and to have emotions. And of course, you could say, well, how do you know a computer won't be conscious? Because we might have unicorns, we might have this. I cannot see how that would happen, given that consciousness, and we understand that very poorly, seems to be dependent on the interplay of chemicals in the body, and indeed a whole body, in order to have that sense. It's not just a bunch of algorithms out of a complex. It's not just learning. In fact, it's the opposite of learning. It's feeling. It's an emotion, which is the most basic form of consciousness.
Do you think there's, could mimicking feel? I mean, I'm just imagining the technologist quipping back. Could you just mimic feelings or something then by software means?
Okay, yeah. Well, you could mimic someone being sad externally, but how are you going to mimic someone internally feeling sad? Because we don't even know. And you're saying that's the problem. Because we don't even know what the salient feature is you'd want to model computationally. Because you tell me, what is the essence of consciousness? It's a subjective interpersonal feeling. But if I said to you now, Joe, while we were talking, I've just discovered how the brain generates consciousness. What would you expect me to show you? What would I show? Yeah, what would I show you?
Exactly.
Yeah, we can't even articulate. Yeah. We can't even articulate what I would show you. Yeah, that would convince you I'd crack with it. So if we don't even know what kind of answer would satisfy that question, we're a long way off from delivering it, surely. Yeah.
Okay. So for my last question then, perhaps we can close with this. So we've got a lot of convergent problems. Recognizing that personal solutions to social problems are insufficient, what are some of the things that you think, how can we turn this tide? What can we do? I think in a way we could exploit the COVID crisis to appreciate the things that we took for granted, but that I think are important, such as exercising outside, and enjoy and stimulate, eating together, which of course many of us haven't been able to do, and especially for small children, and reading rather than, and especially if you've small kids, reading to them, or reading yourself, because that gives you. So there's simple things, which is stories and reading to people, getting outside in it, because I personally run every morning or play squash, and I know in Australia everyone's similarly inclined. That you feel so much better when you've exercised, don't you? You just feel better, and even though it doesn't solve the problems, you're across them, and so I feel sometimes when I've been around that I'd like to bottle this up, this feeling, and just show people what it feels like, because then everyone would do it, and it's so I think physical exercise just for one's own equilibrium, not to say the waistline as well would help here. So physical exercise, eating together, and reading. And I think if one counterbalances the demands of the very big demands of the 21st century, along with all the promises that we have that no one else had, and at least our life expectancy, at least in our respective countries, is much higher. The material benefits are much greater. It would be a great shame if we blow it, if we don't make the most of what that physical ease is offering us. And I think reading books, exercise, eating together with other people, those things, the simple things, perhaps are a good counterbalance to the whiz and bangs of the screen.
Screen culture is, as its name suggests, a whole way of life revolving around the digital devices.
Think about it. Do you touch plastic or human flesh more often? You know, or think about it. How many machines do you have daily relationships with? And on the other hand, how many wild animals do you have daily relationships with? We're already embedded in these machines, and we are enthralled to these machines.
Thank you so much for your time. I really
Okay, stay safe, as they say now. Stay safe, be well, and many thanks.
Yes, and to you.
Yeah, okay, all the best. Take care. Cheers.
You can find Baroness Susan Greenfield's work at susangreenfield.com, and some of her most recent books are A Day in the Life of the Brain, The Neuroscience of Consciousness from Dawn Till Dusk, and Mind Change, How Digital Technologies Are Leaving Their Mark on Our Brains. You can also watch the documentary mentioned throughout this talk at stareintothelightsmypretties.jore.cc. And if you'd like to support future works and more conversations like this, please visit www.jore.cc.